Welcome, everybody, to Business Monday. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO of GoLocal. We're here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm here with Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. Thanks so much for coming in.
Well, thank you for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, the number one story of 2019 in Rhode Island is a massive gas state of emergency. A week ago today, a major error within the supply structure of the Northeast did not supply enough gas, created an absolute crisis, potential of an Andover, Mass type of opportunity if they had repowered the entire gas transmission line at full blast and created an overpressurization. National Grid decided to shut off the entire system for Aquidneck Island, putting about 10,000 people without gas power on one of the coldest days that you'll ever get in the Northeast. And it's taken a full week. Everybody's still not powered up. How did we get here, and how do we not have this happen in these types of situations?
Well, I think when you get to what you just explained, you got to err on the side of safety, and I think that both the utility company, the grid, as well as the governor have done that, and I think that was a smart thing to do. But going forward, we need to make sure that we position, protect the ratepayers in the state of Rhode Island. And there's many ways that we can do that. We've been working for the last few years on things that would help position the ratepayers in a way where they're protected. We regulate the National Grid and all the utilities. The state does. We need to have good relationships with our utilities, but we also need to regulate them and make sure that we protect the consumers.
So immediately within a day, I think we were the first to report that Enbridge, which is a Canadian company that owns the Algonquin gas transmission line that brings it up to the Northeast and actually into Rhode Island, and National Grid, a British-owned company, were at loggerheads with a little bit of finger pointing as to who is responsible for the problem. That's settled down a little bit, although there's not a complete clarity as to who's responsible for what. Are we at a little bit of a disadvantage having these monopolized energy systems in which we're dealing with foreign concerns? In the case of Enbridge, that same day as Rhode Island had its problem, they had a gas transmission line explode in Ohio. Individual was injured, multiple buildings damaged. Are we just a little cog in the global world of energy?
I think we are, and I think that the corporate decisions that are made outside of the state kind of handcuff, I think, in some ways, even what we're used to, right, with Blackstone Valley Electric.
Right. We're just talking about that.
Very, very localized. They're kind of handcuffed. So I think that, again, I continue to talk about the fact that the men and women who are on the ground, I mean, we had 600 to 700 people that came from all over the New England area to service Newport. And when I was down there yesterday and we're driving along the streets and going into the different shops that have been impacted by that, it was very clear that you had a response there with the local people, for the local people, through the grid, through the local police department, through the National Grid. I mean, the response was really strong. But like you said, having a corporation and decisions that could be made on profit lines on behalf of the shareholders, it does put the ratepayers in a
By the way, in the
dilemma.
case of National Grid, it's not even American shareholders; it's UK shareholders.
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah, clearly,
Yeah,
and that's why I think, again, I'll repeat that we need to have good relationships with our utilities, including the National Grid. But we regulate them through the Public Utility Commission, and that's why we've intervened with several dockets over the last few years related to the Public Utility Commission. And we've proposed legislation, and we've got two pieces of legislation that we're going to try to get, again, reintroduced this year, which we will. And then two others that I think, again, continue to protect the ratepayers. And I would say before we dig into the things that, that I responded to your article on in terms of the fines, and try to say, this is why we can't fine the utilities because we don't have the legislation in place. But I can tell you that, to your point about the difficulty of having international companies in Rhode Island not understanding the landscape as well as they need to. I mean, we've been fighting for there was a tax change in the legislation, right?
In federal tax reform, yeah.
moving it from 35% to 21%. We had calculated, our office had calculated that was going to be a big tax windfall for the National Grid, and we got immediately on that and said, let's make sure that gets back to the ratepayers. There was about a $26 million recovery, but we also calculated there was another $8 million, Josh, that was available that should be going back to ratepayers. I just signed paperwork with the joint agreements with the National Grid and the Public Utility Commission because we intervened in that docket, and I'm happy to say that that $8 million is going to get restored. But
That's right.
Look at all the effort that it took to make that happen.
You've been on the forefront of this literally right as the problem was happening in Rhode Island. Massachusetts was fining National Grid for a 2017 storm. They were fining them $750,000 from that storm. By the way, the laundry list of fines issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts against National Grid is significant, multiple million-dollar fines over the past couple of decades. In 2012, Massachusetts fined them for that massive storm in the summer a total of $18 million for failure to plan and failure to respond. Come here, we also had that same problem with the 2017 storm. The PUC investigated, found fault in National Grid's response to it. The governor and you and others were very aggressive with National Grid, and they were fined zero. No incentive to really to change behavior if there's no penalty. You're really on that, both from a standpoint of looking at the opportunity to have some level of penalty, but also that the penalty doesn't turn around and then get passed on to the taxpayer.
Yeah, so the ratepayer, though. And so in that 2017 storm, the things that we've been doing, and we've been out visiting businesses, just like the last 2 days. I've been down in Newport on Friday and Saturday of last week for 2 days, and we were doing the same thing during that storm, Josh, right? So our office gets calls from small businesses all the time now because they know that we're a go-to place to help solve problems. We were visiting businesses during that storm that were out several days more than they should have out of electricity. People losing $10,000 on a manufacturing company, calculated. Businesses that weren't able to ship out almost $300,000 worth of product. Businesses that had trade shows that were going to be up in Boston that had to cancel those trade shows because they could not make the product that they needed to bring up there in the food industry. So we started looking at, well, what can we do to help these businesses and all the ratepayers in general when there's not a strong response. And like you said, that report was a pretty scathing report that the PUC actually presented. One example was that 600 calls were made to properties that the electricity order had already turned on. So you had repeat calls that should be going somewhere else. So those were the type of things I said. So, but what was lacking in Rhode Island was a storm response legislation. And Massachusetts passed this storm response legislation a few years back. The National Grid and the utilities pushed it all the way to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not it was a constitutional law. The Supreme Court supported the ratepayers and said it was. And since that time, almost $30 million of penalties have been imposed on the utilities in Massachusetts. Same storm, $750,000, right, as you just mentioned.
In Mass.
But in Rhode Island, zero. And the legislation that's in Massachusetts, we mirrored that last year. But I can tell you that, you know, the grid did a great job on behalf of its shareholders last year, and it pushed back, with its lobbyists in the State House, and it squashed that storm response bill. The same bill that's in Massachusetts holding them accountable. They didn't want to see that accountability in Rhode Island. We're going to continue to work to make that happen. And what's happening in Newport, we don't, and when I was visiting the businesses down there, look, we want to make sure that we solve their problem, and we don't want to use them to just move something forward that's not helpful to them. But we know in 17 it happened in a certain area of the state. Now it's happening in 19 in Newport.
Right.
This legislation will put the PUC in a position where it can actually levy penalties where it's called for.
The burden now, the game shifts over to legislative leaders, right? I mean, you're going to put in the same legislation. It mirrors the Massachusetts statute. Massachusetts has been successful at gaining their attention and getting some level of punitive action against them. It really goes to the House and the Senate to have them step forward.
The House and Senate, and then it gets involved with the committee work and the committee hearings, and and then those who are advocating on both sides of the scale, right? We're advocating for the ratepayers. The National Grid's lobbyists are lobbying on behalf of the international company that they represent and the interests of the shareholders.
Do they sing at any point "God Save the Queen" or things like that during the course of these?
No, there was no "God Save the Queen," but I think it was done very quietly, very politely. There was nobody yelling and screaming.
That's the way the Brits are.
That's what I would say. So I guess they brought their British culture over.
This legislation should pass, and Prince Philip should not drive a car at 98 years old.
That legislation should pass. We've got a consumer, response, service response bill that's been predicated based on continuously, Josh, companies who are asking for transformers, telephone poles, meters. I just had one down in Newport just Friday tell me that same story. So a customer service thing, we're going to impose penalties if the service levels are not responsive enough. That's in there. And then I would ask you just below me just say two other pieces,
please,
right, that are really important. And these two pieces of legislation could save ratepayers in the state of Rhode Island millions of dollars a year, and it's an easy lift. It has to do with the purchasing your electricity. Mm-hmm. The fact that we have deregulation in the state and people can purchase their electricity from a third-party supplier. But what we're saying is we want to make sure when your contract ends, you immediately go back to the National Grid's standard offer.
Right.
Because what happens is people forget to cancel it, and then they get put into a variable rate that's significantly
and it's
higher.
Punitive.
That's correct. And then the other one is door-to-door sales, telemarketing. We want a legislation to put in there so the predatory practices that could be out there to sales, we want legislation that says, look, you have to calculate and sign off on paper that this is going to save money. This is what the rate that the grid is charging right now. This is the rate that we're going to charge, and based on utility usage, this is what you're going to save. And then make sure that there's damages to those companies if they're doing predatory type sales practices. That alone, those two pieces of legislation on the third-party sales, Josh, we've had $27 million over the last 5 years of additional cost to the ratepayer because they didn't shop smartly, and they were kind of like, and in some ways, fraudulently given information. That alone would save millions of dollars. We're hopeful that that's going to get some traction. We'll be meeting with the Attorney General next week to talk about consumer protection.
That's great. One of the other problems is our electricity supply comes from the production via natural gas. The New York Times had a piece in the end of December breaking down each of the states. Rhode Island was one of the highest, and 94% of our electricity comes from production via natural gas. At a time in which renewables are now price competitive in development, we're still behind, despite some improvement. We're still significantly behind in production of wind and solar. That's got to be part of the mix in the long term.
Yeah, and I think that the governor has put forward, not only Governor Chafee, now Governor Raimondo, and the General Assembly has put forward some objectives to make sure that we move in the right direction in terms of renewables. I want to just make sure that that we're doing it smart, and that we're not getting ahead of the curve. But if like you're saying, if we're behind the curve, then let's catch up. I think we should ride the bumper of the technology right on the bumper.
Right.
If it goes 10 miles an hour, let's go 9.9 miles an hour. If it goes 100 miles an hour, let's go 99 miles an hour. But I think that we need to make sure that we continue with the renewables to position Rhode Island in a way that we haven't been able to do in the past. But now that technology is stronger, better, and more reasonable, so we should be taking advantage of that.
Well, Lieutenant Governor, I appreciate you taking the time to come in. Good luck with the legislation. We look forward to keeping folks up to date on the progress on this. I think it'll be interesting to see what takes place in the investigation that I believe is developing into what the causes are and the responses. I think, for the first week, the response was fairly immediate and well coordinated between the governor and his office and National Grid, and now we'll see what the implications are. Listen, if you know the Newport economy, you know that a lot of small businesses down there, 20% of Thames Street turns over every year, and to be closed down for a week or 2 weeks is a huge problem for them, especially at a time when there's low unemployment. You'll lose a worker. Workers can't wait around if you don't have the cash flow off season to be able to be paying people, hoping and praying you're going to get reimbursed by National Grid or other parties.
Yeah, that's got to be clarified, the reimbursement
Yeah.
strategy there. But and you and I, you know, we share the fact that we've been in small business. We know what that means. That's why I got out there and talked to people. I thank you for, you know, covering this story. I know there's millions of dollars that could be saved to the ratepayers that we do smart things legislatively that, quite frankly, don't even hurt the national grid.
Yeah.
They just protect the consumer. We need to make sure that we put the ratepayers in a spot where we're representing them. And offsetting the fact, as you said, the international play here
Right.
to represent the shareholders is one that we need to take serious and make sure we level that playing field.
I'll end it with this. Bob Whitcomb was in on Friday before he came on air. We were talking in the green room. He's talking about when he was over at the Providence Journal and the electricity would go out. And somebody at the Journal, him or somebody else, would call over to Bob McCabe,
Yeah.
who was the head of Narragansett Electric, which was locally owned, public company. Say, Bob, our electricity's out. Bob would say, I'm sorry. Let me get somebody right over there and fix it. And then he'd call back an hour later and said, hey, it's all fixed. And that's kind of the way, you know, you'd kind of hope that the system would work. We had a battle with them for 2 days. We just asked, are you apologizing to Newporters? They gave one of those very amorphous responses in this situation, I'm sure, and under direction of legal counsel as to don't apologize.
Yeah, welcome to the 2019 and the litigious society, right? So
That's right.
yeah, you got to be careful. But we need to be. I'll just reiterate: we need to have good relationships with our utilities,
Yeah.
including the National Grid, and I did that as a mayor. But also, we need to make sure we represent the ratepayers in a way that, quite frankly, they have not been represented over the last few years, and we're making every effort to make that happen.
Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee,
Okay.
thanks so much.
Okay.
We're going to be back in about 20 minutes with Gary Sass, the money man, talking about state budget, federal shutdowns, and you name it, he knows it all. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you back at 4 o'clock.